The Yorkville scene. I'd never seen anything like it. Music was everywhere. 2 years before the Summer of Love, it was like this big deal. That quote comes from Neil Young, and he ought to know. During the 60s, Yorkville was arguably the most important cultural location in Canada, launching the careers of people that have made such enormous contributions that we can hardly remember what Canadian music was like before they arrived. In our last episode, we didn't have enough time to give this topic the attention that it deserves, so this week will be dedicated to the rise and fall of the Yorkville music scene. I'm Adam Weiser.
And I'm Grayson Miller, and this is Muddy York.
This episode is about music. However, it won't actually feature any music. The reason is simple. As I speak, there is a man watching me from across the street. Do you see him, Gray?
Yeah, I see him.
Now, unlike most stalkers, he's dressed in a suit and holding a Starbucks cup. He's a music industry lawyer, just waiting for us to play even a single note so he can file a copyright suit against us. Now, as much as we love our audience, we just can't compete against this kind of firepower. So you'll have to go to YouTube if you want to hear the songs or the artists that we're talking about. Now, I'm very familiar with this music, even though it comes from before my time. Throughout my life, my father always held firm to his belief that musical composition stopped in 1974. So as a child, I would constantly hear these songs on the radio whenever I was riding in the car. And I find that I know these performers, even if I didn't recognize their names. A song would come up and I would go to YouTube to hear what it was and, oh, I've heard that before. I've heard it many times. How well do you know music from the 60s, Gray?
My family was a pretty musical family, so I'm pretty well versed, I think.
So, to do a quick recap of our last episode, the Yorkville music scene began because Toronto General Hospital was expanding, and it displaced a countercultural community along Gerrard that moved a few kilometers north to Yorkville. The most obvious sign of this migration was the proliferation of coffee houses and the local Victorian row houses. These were not the high-end operations that we know today. The Purple Onion, one of the first Yorkville coffee houses, was founded by a group of guys in their 20s who pooled their savings to come up with the $750 needed to rent the building. And just take a moment there to figure, renting a building in Yorkville costs $750. Today, that might get you a tiny corner of one room. But just like our last episode, we're going to be playing excerpts from an interview that we conducted with Mel Eisen, one of the co-founders of the Purple Onion. Here is his description of how they got started.
My friends were going into accountancy. So they were out, they weren't actually in school, they were working. And so we decided, we started an investment club. We made some money and then decided to open up this club. And that's basically how it went. Really didn't know what we were doing or how big a deal it was at the time, but we were excited about getting it started. And we were very fortunate that it became as popular as it did.
These new cafes became clubhouses for writers, musicians, and other bohemian types. At a time when Toronto coffee came in exactly two flavors, regular and decaf, exotic drinks like espresso and cappuccino had a sophisticated European vibe. Another important factor is that many of the coffeehouse patrons were underage. At that time, the drinking age in Ontario was 21, and it was strictly enforced. Only a small number of bars on Yonge Street had liquor licenses, and they usually attracted an older crowd who went there after work. The new coffee houses provided a place where younger people could hang out throughout the evening. Initially, they didn't feature any music. As one person put it, the closest thing they had to entertainment was chess. Eventually, local patrons were allowed to perform there for free. But as more coffee houses opened, peaking at 22 in 1965, music became the primary way of attracting customers. And most of the time, that music was folk. Here's Mel again.
It was a group of people that were looking to perform, and it evolved into the folk scene. But at the time, these were just people from all over Canada trying to get a place where they could sing, be part of the folk culture. And we didn't even know, really, I don't think at the time, that this was what was going to happen or what was going on.
During the late 50s, the Kingston Trio became stars and sparked a folk music revival that would carry on through most of the 60s. Despite their importance, most of the performers in Yorkville didn't want to emulate them. The Kingston Trio projected a clean-cut image and avoided most protest songs. The Yorkville performers liked folk music because it was seen as political. Folk music seemed to connect the anger of the civil rights movement with the intellectualism of the beat scene. As one village regular put it, folk music, that was a culture of the people writing songs that had some meaning. It was coming out of black music, so it was authentic. It was so relevant then, and it was so focused, so the folk musicians who were there were getting so much attention.
Ian and Sylvia became the first big Yorkville success story. They are one of the groups that are iconic in their moment, but then seem to largely disappear. One of their songs, called Four Strong Winds, was a phenomenon during the 60s. One broadcaster called it Canada's alternative national anthem. When CBC held a competition about the 50 most essential Canadian songs, it came in first. And I tell this story because I remember listening to that broadcast and being completely bewildered by the win because I had never heard that song before in my life. Ian Tyson was a graphic designer who hitchhiked from Vancouver, and Sylvia Fricker was a small-town girl from Chatham. They first performed together because union rules prevented Sylvia from accompanying herself on a CBC broadcast. At that time, performances at most Toronto clubs were restricted to members of the musicians' union, so Yorkville became a way for non-union performers to get their foot in the door. Ian and Sylvia were noted for the unique harmony of their voices. Pretty soon, coffee houses were paying them the exorbitant fee of $20 a night. As one owner said, no one ever seemed to get bored with them. One performance at the Village Corner inspired an audience member who said, "When I saw that combination of folk and country music, I knew it was what I had been looking for. It was like seeing the light of day." His name was Gordon Lightfoot, and he will shortly be playing a very big role in this story. The Canadian recording industry barely existed at this time, so Ian and Sylvia had to go to New York if they wanted to make it big. At one of the Greenwich Village clubs, they met another folk singer who they described as looking like a scruffy bub. "It was Bob Dylan, man!" I'm not sure if that was any good. You may want to cut that out, Gray, or you may just want to leave it in so people can laugh at my terrible Bob Dylan impression. Dylan had two major effects on this story. One is that he wrote his own songs. Until then, folk singers usually performed traditional melodies or covers of other folk songs. Dylan's influence would make songwriting the norm. The other came from Dylan's famous decision to plug in and shift from folk music to rock and roll. Lots of people would follow his example, shifting from pure folk to folk rock to psychedelic rock by the end of the decade.
Until the mid-60s, there was a clear division between the venues on Yonge Street that played rock and roll or country and the venues in Yorkville that played folk. As Neil Young put it, "I didn't see much folk rock in Toronto. It was either folk or rock." That line began to blur in 1964 when an after-hours club called Brave New World opened on Davenport. It was the first club in Yorkville to regularly book rock or rhythm and blues acts. We're not calling it R&B because this was old school rhythm and blues. Beatlemania took this trend into overdrive as band after band tried to copy their look and their sound. One of the most successful local imitators was called Jack London and the Sparrows, who performed at the Chez Monique. The band spoke in fake English accents, and the lead singer claimed he was from Liverpool. After replacing Jack London, it turned out that this guy was stealing most of the band's earnings. The Sparrows would move towards more of a blues rock sound. Eventually, they would rename themselves Steppenwolf and have a series of hits including Born to be Wild and Magic Carpet Rides, both great songs. The person who most successfully straddled the line between folk and rock during this period was Gordon Lightfoot. After getting a start in Yorkville, he had started playing at Steele's Tavern on Yonge Street, where he would hang out with rockabilly icon Ronnie Hawkins. After summoning up the nerve to play one of his own songs for a performance at the College of Teachers, Ian and Sylvia arranged for their management company to sign him. In 1965, Lightfoot was lured back to Yorkville to play at the Riverboat, which would become the most prestigious club in the neighborhood. It could seat 120, and every seat was in close proximity to the stage. Lightfoot said, "For me, the Riverboat was my first taste of the big time. It was very dark and had a wonderful ambiance, and it really did give you the idea that you were on some sort of boat." At first, Lightfoot was paid $125 to perform 4 sets 6 nights a week. Within a year, he was getting $1,200 a week, but he brought in so much business that the Riverboat was willing to pay. Other famous musicians to play at the club included Simon and Garfunkel, R.O. Guthrie, James Taylor, Harry Belafonte, and Neil Young. Joni Mitchell claims she was offered a kitchen job the first time she auditioned there, but the Riverboat's owner always denied that story. She would perform there in 1966, and it may have been where she debuted Both Sides Now, another fantastic album, although there is some debate on that point. Not the album, but whether she recorded it there. Neil Young would release a live album recorded at the Riverboat, and he paid tribute to the club in Ambulance Blues.
By the mid-60s, the Yorkville music scene had reached its peak, with around 40 different clubs and coffee houses booking music. Here's a rundown of some of the other famous locations. We've already mentioned the Purple Onion, so here's Mel's description of what it was like.
Our place had a sort of an atmosphere, I guess, a feeling of being very plain, very simple, and it really helped the folklore kind of attitude. And I think that had a lot to do with the fact that we had people lined up almost to Bloor Street to get in.
Carly Simon played there when she was still part of a duo with her sister called the Simon Sisters. Buffy St. Marie would famously write her protest song, Universal Soldier, in the basement. Most importantly, a trio known as the Couriers would play the Onion 5 different times between 1961 and 63. In fact, CBC would record one of the performances in 62. This is significant because one of the members of this trio would have an absolutely brilliant nephew who would go on to co-host a podcast about the history of Toronto. The Penny Farthing was primarily a blues venue, but it had a basement stage for beginners that gave several people their start in Toronto, including a girl from Alberta named Joni Anderson, better known today as Joni Mitchell. It was also famous for putting a swimming pool in the backyard where patrons could cool off, and for waitresses who would sometimes wear bikinis to encourage larger tips. Newgate of the Cleve would play host to jazzmen like Lonnie Johnson and John Lee Hooker. But the most noteworthy performer, at least for me, was a folk singer named Sharon Troston, better known to generations of Canadian children as Sharon from Sharon, Lois and Bram. The Village Corner was best known as the place where Ian and Sylvia launched their career. In a column for The Star, Pierre Burton described it as a mad melange of candles and bottles, pictures of folk singers, travel posters, offbeat murals, and hand-lettered signs, slightly self-conscious. The Mousetrap was the unheated backroom of a larger venue called La Coterie Café, but it became the center of gay life in Yorkville during the early 60s. It was known for all-ages queer-friendly dances that produced lines running down the block. However, it closed in 1963, and the gay scene would largely migrate to Yonge Street. Finally, the Myna Bird was known for its eccentric owner, who had a pet Myna bird named Raja and firmly believed that sex sells. The club featured go-go girls dancing in the second-floor window, but he tried to balance things out by employing a nude male chef. Now, there are some hygienic and practical questions that come from how a nude male chef would work, but presumably these were worked out, or perhaps they weren't.
I'm guessing they weren't.
Now, this guy would also manage a band called the Minor Birds. This guy being the guy who owned the club, not the new male chef.
For a second, I was like, this guy has some diverse talents.
And the Minor Birds were fronted by a young Rick James. But you won't learn anything more about this band, their connection to the Eatons, or their manager's wild publicity schemes, because Gray is planning to do a future episode about them, so you'd better stay tuned if you want to hear about it, because some of it is pretty wild stuff.
There was also a host of local bands that never quite made it, like the Poppers, who played the Monterey Pop Festival and bombed because they were on acid, or Kensington Market, psychedelic rockers who were described as Canada's answer to Jefferson Airplane. There were also Canadian artists who played Yorkville with one band but found fame with another, like Denny Doherty, who played the Village Corner with the Halifax Three, but then found success a few years later with the Mamas and the Papas. Yorkville really had something for everyone, and all of it was within walking distance. That proximity meant that musicians could check out each other's performances and sit in with each other to collaborate. It made Yorkville a place where different musical styles could mix and merge. There was also the sense of community that comes from having a lot of young people in one place with a lot of time, but not with a lot of money. Here's Mel one more time.
At that time, when you're thinking about the 60s to the mid-60s, they were not stars. They were just looking to get fed and to have a place where they could play and sing and be part of the scene that was going on. And that was the thing, I think. We all felt that way. We wanted to be part of the scene. I was living at home. My parents always wondered, why did I come home at 3 o'clock in the morning? Until I got my father to come down and see what was going on. Then he understood what it was all about. It was a culture. It was a way of living, in a sense.
In 1971, the province lowered the drinking age to 18. It would be raised to 19 in 1978. Suddenly, the Yorkville coffee houses lost one of their main competitive advantages, the fact that they were all ages venues. The small number of remaining clubs found it hard to compete with young street clubs that could afford to pay higher fees for performers by selling alcohol. Developers were snapping up real estate throughout Yorkville, and Hazelton Lanes would open in 1975. The Riverboat was the last venue to survive, but it would close in 1978. Folk singer Murray McLaughlin was the final performer. He opened his set by saying, "I want to thank everyone for coming down to kiss the old riverboat goodbye tonight. I'm glad we're giving it a decent burial." Sometimes, one city or one neighborhood will create a music scene whose influence reaches far beyond its borders. Yorkville was one of those scenes. The list of folk, rock, and folk rock musicians who began their careers there is kind of remarkable. But this scene didn't just change music, it also changed Toronto. Today we take it for granted that major musical acts will pass through Toronto and that some of those acts will be from here. But that's not how it used to. Before the 60s, a small number of locals might succeed in the music industry, but only by moving to the States and leaving their roots behind. This period marked the first time that Canadians could make music in Canada and the rest of the world would listen. And because it was great music, artists wanted to come to the place where it was all being made. For a few short years, Yorkville was that place. As a final note, if you're feeling nostalgic or if you just want to learn more about the Yorkville scene, YorkvilleCoffeeHouses.org, that's all one word, provides detailed lists of the different people who performed at the myriad venues throughout the neighborhood. Now, these lists are based on content from the Toronto paper, so they don't include everything, but they're still an impressive resource. And we'd like to thank Doug Harper for putting these lists together. It's a really impressive work.
Well, guys, that's the episode for today. Remember to write a review for this episode and for our podcast series. It's a great way for people to discover it. Give us 5 stars on any platform you're on. And remember to tune in for the next time on Muddy York.